My name is Rafael Chandler, and I'm a freelance video game writer, and I'm here at the Montreal International Games Summit to talk about video game writing. Specifically, the process of writing a game, how it's actually done, because something I've observed is that we need more discussion on a professional level about how to do something like writing a video game. You get a bunch of coders in a room together, and they all know exactly what to do when it comes to creating game code. But every company I've ever worked at, there's been a different way to approach the process of writing a video game. And in fact, sometimes I've worked at one company, and on different projects in the same company, they have a completely different approach. So basically, with every game, you reinvent the wheel. So I'm very focused on the procedure and the production of creating a video game. Now, my hook is, the presentation is called Squad-Based Tactical Writer, because I've worked on so many squad-based tactical shooters, and I started to realize that when I work on a game, I tend to approach it the same way that I would approach playing a squad-based tactical shooter. Well, so in a squad-based tactical shooter, you have clearly defined roles: sniper, grenadier, commanding officer, intelligence analyst who comes over the radio and tells you there are tangos coming, be ready. Well, in game development, you also have very formally structured roles. You have a lead designer, and then you have a story designer, and you maybe have a multiplayer designer, but everybody has a job title and a role. When you clearly define these roles and responsibilities and the tasks that go with them, and then everybody moves in concert together, it's not unlike a squad-based tactical shooter, where everybody's doing exactly what they need to do to achieve a goal or objective. Now, I really believe firmly in a strong creative vision from the beginning. The first step of your process at the beginning of game development is to remove everything that is superfluous. Like Michelangelo, the sculptor, said that his sculpture was already there inside the stone, and what he did was he removed everything that wasn't necessary, and then you could see the sculpture there waiting for you. Well, by the same token, when you begin pre-production on a video game and you say, well, what kind of a game are we making? What's the story going to be about? You have to start removing things that don't belong, however good they might be, just because at a certain point you're just going to have to say, all right, we finished pre-production, it's time to start building the game. What are we making exactly? So really that first third of the game, well, that first section, which should be 10 to 20, maybe 30% of your game development, that pre-production, is where you answer those big questions. What kind of a game are we making? What is the fixed goal we're moving towards? The trick is to make sure that those decisions aren't made arbitrarily, that you're not just saying, well, let's do this because. There has to be a fundamental, and you'd be surprised how often decisions get made at the last minute because, well, this seems cool, but is it going to be cool? And how do you find out if it is? Well, prototyping. You see a lot of prototyping in gameplay, where you say, well, let's build a quick mock-up mission and run through it and say, okay, how does this level flow? But do you do that with story? And how can you do that with story? Well, by recording dialogue in-house and putting it in the game, by creating mock-ups of your cinematics before you actually build the cinematics. So I think it's that process of identifying what would work and why, and then verifying it. Always verify and test and then refine and go back to the drawing board. I do think story is becoming more important in the sense that in the past it's always been there, it's just been neglected. In the same way that you want your multiplayer gameplay types, and you want your art direction, and you want your user interface to be as good as they can be, the narrative ought to be as good as it can be. So it's really just, I think, an industry-wide effort to bring narrative up to the level of graphics, or to bring narrative up to the level of multiplayer gameplay types in their own respective importance to the developers. So it's not that you're saying story is more important than any other element, it's just that it's one area where I think all game studios could benefit from taking a step back and saying, how can we improve it across the board? And I think that the creativity is not the issue. I've played enough games where I've seen just some really wild ideas, some really interesting twists and turns. I think the implementation of that creativity is where we're hurting. So, that's a good question. So how do you integrate narrative with a focus on game production? Well, I think you need to begin by treating the narrative like any other aspect of game development. You need to be objective. You need to have clearly defined roles on your project, people who actually are responsible for creating this or that element. But you have to have formally delineated stages. All too often, I hear writers talk about how they write a draft of their dialogue and they're done. You write the draft, you hand it in, the designer, the producer, management, whoever, looks it over and says, okay, that looks good, and it's sent off. But that's not how you write a movie or a TV show. you have a process by which you sit at a table, you read it out loud, you talk about it. You say, well, how does this drive forward our story, or is this really getting across what we want? Not only that, but when you actually record a movie or a TV show, your actors are not sitting there with scripts in their hands. They've studied the dialogue. They know what the game or the TV show or the movie is about. But all too often, and with video games, you meet the actor, hand the actor the script, and record the actor during the first 5 minutes. And then you're done as soon as that 2 or 3 hour period is over, and you're finished, and that was it. You couldn't record a movie that way or a TV show, so why would you take that approach to video games? If you already have a full-time writer on your staff, it's just a question of using your people more effectively. Yeah. It isn't any more expensive, but also bear in mind that even if you were to go from hiring a part-time writer to come in for a few weeks and write some dialogue, and then you change that to having a full-time writer on staff for however much a full-time writer costs your company, that change in salary is a drop in the bucket when you're working on a $15 million AAA project. If your game does cost, as a lot of games do, $15, $20 million, if it's going to result in a stronger and more robust narrative that'll result in better reviews, then yeah, I think it's a drop in the bucket. I think that even if you hire somebody for 6 figures, it's still a negligible expense if that's what you're interested in. But honestly, I don't think it's a question of hiring somebody full-time or bringing more people in or spending more money. It's just a question of taking the existing processes that already exist in other parts of game development and applying them to the creation of your story. Things like Scrum or Agile methodology. Terms that producers are familiar with, but game writers don't necessarily always spend a lot of time thinking. I am a freelance game writer, but I've spent the past 2 years working for Sony. Specifically, I've been working with Zipper Interactive, that's a subsidiary of Sony, and I've also been working with Slant 6 Games in Vancouver, and they are working with Sony. I've worked with them on 4 games total between the 2 studios. 2 of these games are unannounced. The other 2 games are MAG, which is a placeholder name for this new PS3 title, Massive Action Game, which is going to be the largest online shooter ever made on a console. 256 players. And it has a really interesting backstory, and I've been working with them on shaping the backstory and the nature of the characters who will be narrating the events in this multiplayer-focused game. And I've also been working on 2 other projects that are a little more story-driven because they're single-player titles, as opposed to MAG, which is multiplayer only. So I can't really talk in detail about what I've been doing, but I've been working more or less full-time with these 2 studios for the past 2 years. I also spent a little bit of time working with a company in Texas called Edge of Reality, and they're working on a new game of aggressive stealth infiltration, sort of, I guess, a more aggressive take on the stealth genre pioneered by Splinter Cell and Thief and Assassin's Creed. And even though I'm not a full-time employee and I do a lot of traveling and I work off-site at my house, I'm still more or less connected to the development team through phone, through email, through instant messaging programs. Even through the PS3, we do video chat over the PS3 with the iToy or the PS3i. And because I'm working so closely with so many different members of the development team, I really have a feel for what's going on in the game, and that does help me to anticipate problems that will arise in the game's narrative later on down the line. And I think there are more and more freelance writers. Rhianna Pratchett wrote Mirror's Edge. Susan O'Connor has worked on BioShock, Gears of War, a host of other fascinating... Oh, Far Cry 2. She worked on Far Cry 2. So she's worked on a lot of games as a freelancer. And I think more and more studios are turning to experienced freelancers who have the benefit of having worked at a number of different companies and have maybe a bird's eye view of the industry, just because they haven't been working at the same in the same company for so long. You know, they have a different view of the business because they work for so many different places and have a feel for so many different ways to solve problems. But it definitely is, I think it's a specialty that a lot of companies are sort of looking at, simply because you don't necessarily need a full-time in-house writer all year long. If you're working on one game, when you're in production, there's only so much writing that you need to do. And then during, of course, the production segment, you have a lot of dialogue that needs to be written, cinematic scripts. But then during the testing phase, what can the writer really contribute to the project? So it might be better to have contract employees in that regard, just because you don't necessarily have a 365-day-a-year cycle for a game writer.